Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. We are live on Zoom and live streaming on YouTube. In just a minute, I will introduce my friend and our guest, Sarah Levin of the Secular Strategies. But before we begin, I want to remind you that you can join us on Zoom for these events. And to get that login information, you need to go to our meetup group at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. You can join us there and look for more events to be announced soon. This event is part of our bi-weekly educational programming that we will continue to stream as YouTube events. You can find all of our past speaker series and follow us on YouTube at youtube.com/CFL Freethought. Lastly, if you want to be sure to get monthly email updates for upcoming activities, all of which are online right now, go to tinyurl/CFFC newsletter. Give us your email and any other contact information that you like, and we promise to keep in touch. And also, we hope that you're going to join us for upcoming social events that we have no less than weekly. Actually, there's usually multiple events every week. And you can find all of that Zoom login information in our meetup group at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. Of course, Facebook, CFL Freethought, you can find us there as well. All right, so if you're with us today in the Zoom meeting, you're welcome to have your camera on as you like. It's kind of nice when you're speaking to actually see people. But we have your microphones muted so that you don't accidentally interrupt the session itself. You can find the chat option available at the bottom of your screen on your computer. Feel free to chat with one another there. If you're on a mobile device, just tap the screen and that should appear as an option. Chat is where we want you to ask questions, so put those in there and we're going to try to get up to all of those that we can today. All right, so with that taken care of there, we're going to get started. Sarah Levin is the founder and principal at Secular Strategies, which is a consulting firm specializing in mobilization of non-religious voters and empowering its clients to be effective advocates for secularism in the US. Sarah has a great history. She's awesome. She's worked for the Secular Coalition for America from 2013 to 2019 in a whole bunch of different roles, including Director of Grassroots and Community Programs, Director of Governmental Affairs. That's when I first met Sarah, and her relationship with the CFFC began there. Sarah proudly represents the secular community as co-chair of the Democratic National Committee's Interfaith Council, where she helped to pass a resolution in 2019 that expressly welcomes religiously unaffiliated voters into the party by recognizing their values and historic marginalization. Prior to joining the Secular Coalition, Sarah completed her AmeriCorps service by serving low-income immigrant and refugee families as a bilingual community liaison in Arlington, Virginia. She graduated cum laude with a bachelor's degree in international studies from American University, where she served on the board of the university's Secular Student Alliance affiliate. And to quote Sarah regarding what she's doing right now, "Grassroots political advocacy is my passion. I specialize in developing strategic and inspiring issue campaigns that compel individuals to take action." That's the type of person we're going to be talking to today. I'm excited. Sarah, it's great to see you here again, and welcome to Central Florida.
Thank you. Thank you. That was such a great introduction. Thank you. It's great to be here. I often point to CFFC as one of the leading examples of what secular community activism should look like. So I want to commend David and Jocelyn for their many years of work. I plead you to not burn yourselves out, because we need you more than ever in Florida, but also leading by example for folks across the country. So thank you for your work. I'm really excited about your race, Jocelyn. I'm definitely going to reference it in my presentation today, because it's one component of what we do need to do to build political clout. So I'm just going to jump into the presentation here. Just give me a second to make sure
you all can see what I see. It is a team effort here at the CFFC. It's not just David and I. We have a team of people helping out. So it's all of us together.
Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll jump in. Thanks for having me, everybody. So Jocelyn already spoke at length about secular strategies, so I'll just jump into what we're here to talk about today, which is how the secular community can build political clout. I'll have this slide with my contact information at the end as well. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and to email me directly if you'd like to get in touch. So first, and this is probably not new information to a lot of you, and this doesn't go up into well, actually, this does go up to about 2018, 2019. You can see here, and we've heard this a lot, that the number of Christians in the United States is going down, folks who identify as Christian, and the amount of religiously unaffiliated folks is growing really, really rapidly. And they used to tell us that, well, a lot of those folks are young people, they're just going to get more religious as they get older. Now we have enough data to show that's not the case. And this trajectory is definitely going to continue. So, it depends on the poll you look at, and you always have to look at, how they ask a question with any given poll that gives you numbers. So you might have heard different numbers from different places about how many religiously unaffiliated folks there are. I do want to quickly note that term religiously unaffiliated is not interchangeable with atheist or non-theist. About roughly a third of the religiously unaffiliated say they don't believe in God, and an even smaller amount of that group that does not believe in God actually call themselves something like atheist or agnostic or humanist. And then the rest of the roughly 2/3 are everything from spiritual but not religious to unattached believers, meaning that people who believe in a higher power but aren't affiliated with a specific denomination. So I just like to kind of define terms a little bit before I use them. So when I say religiously unaffiliated, I'm talking about that whole block of people from the self-affirming atheist to the non-theist without a label to the unattached believers. And I think that a lot of naysayers have said that because of that wide variety of difference in beliefs or lack of belief among the unaffiliated, that just means it's a no-go to mobilize them as a voting bloc. I strongly disagree, and I'm going to make my case today of why that's not the case. But I think it's important that we understand sort of what we're talking about here. So now that I've sort of established what we're talking about, about 1 in 4 Americans are now religiously unaffiliated, and they skew young. A huge chunk of the unaffiliated are millennials and Gen Z and so forth. And so this is the most secular generation we've ever seen, and it's only going to grow from here. This, further proves the point that what I was just saying. You look at the age group here. This only goes up to 2016, but you can see here how much of a chunk the folks 18 to 29 make up this demographic. So here's a question I want to pose to you, and Jocelyn, if you like me to, maybe we'll use the chat instead of having people mute themselves. But I wanted to ask, given these demographic advantages of the religiously unaffiliated are the largest, fastest growing demographic of the country, and the demographic base of what I think most of us see as our opposition, the Christian nationalists, which get much of their base from the white evangelical base, which is shrinking. Why is it, given these demographics, why don't we have more political influence than we do? So I'm curious, I wanted to see what folks would say and then go from there. So tell me in the chat, why do you think that we don't have more political influence despite the fact that our numbers are so large? And I might have to re-show that slide in a second so I can actually see what everyone is saying. Actually, Jocelyn, if you don't mind, because I'm having trouble navigating to the chat, if you could just tell me kind of what folks are saying. I think you're muted.
Because one comment was from me, which was because we don't identify as a group, ? Many are non-joiners was what one person said. No centralized leadership or organization, another person said.
Okay, those are all really good. So the first, I'll address all three and then address a few other factors. So the first was, you said that we don't all identify as a group, right? So I think part of what we need to do is, I think for too long we've been focused on, well, we all need to use the same identity. We need to use the same label to sort of be part of one thing. I actually don't think that's necessary, and I think it's not possible. There is no perfect word that everyone is going to feel perfectly describes them. I really do think that on the one hand, if the more that we destigmatize identifying as an atheist and agnostic, the more people will feel comfortable using those labels, but that won't completely solve everything, because even when people are more comfortable using those labels, there's also a lot of people who just don't feel those labels best describe them, or they have other, or they don't like to use labels at all. And that's particularly true of the new and younger generation that don't necessarily ascribe to those kinds of labels, even if they share our worldview. There's just we're not going to get everybody to call themselves an atheist. We're not going to get everybody to call themselves a free thinker. We're not going to get everybody to call themselves humanists. I just don't think that's going to happen, but I don't think it's necessary. I think one thing we need to understand is, on the one hand, the non-religious, just like any faith constituency, has shared values, but we are distinct from believers in that we organize ourselves differently, we orient ourselves differently, and the way we see ourselves is different, right? Because I mean, as I described earlier, I mean, the folks who make up the unaffiliated are it's so vast, and it even includes believers. And so what I'll point in a few slides, I'll come back to this point. I'll show you that what I've been saying that can unite this group is not a label in terms of, the right word that describes our identity, right? The funny thing is, even Christian doesn't describe a lot of Christians, right? There's Christian and then there's more, right? What denomination are they? And then maybe a split within that denomination, especially because of segregation within Christianity. There's, kind of a distinguishing factor between white evangelicals and Black evangelicals, right? But they still sort of have that overarching Christian label. But I think just like any, Christians are so varied in their beliefs that, calling someone Christian doesn't really actually tell you a whole lot about what someone believes until you investigate further. It's the same thing with the unaffiliated. I mean, knowing that someone's non-religious, or even knowing that someone's an atheist or agnostic, doesn't entirely tell you much about them, right? There's as many varied beliefs as there are people. But one thing that I think brings us together that is really extraordinary is the level to which we agree on issues. And in fact, and I'll show this a few slides from now, we agree even in higher numbers as a block of people on key issues, even hot button issues like abortion. We agree more than white evangelicals do on those issues. And I think that's really important to underscore, because white evangelicals are very obviously powerful and influential, have a lot of political clout, and we can see how that's manifested under the Trump administration. And you would think, with, for example, abortion being such a top issue for the Christian right, I mean, look at, the saliency of the Supreme Court, right? They've all kind of, that's been a major point of mobilization for their demographic, is just getting conservatives on the Supreme Court, and because of abortion. But even when you look at an issue like abortion, the religiously unaffiliated agree in higher numbers on that issue in terms of what the policy should be than white evangelicals do, by as much as 10 percentage points. What that says to me, is that we have the ability to mobilize around values and our shared values and where we stand on the issues. Because clearly, when you look at the data, we may not all use the same label. We may not all even organize in the same place, every month or every week. But clearly, there's something about the underlying perspective of being non-religious and being unaffiliated that leads you to these certain conclusions. And of course, a lot of those conclusions are shared by progressive people of faith. But for example, the Public Religion Research Institute just last week issued their annual American Values Atlas survey. I encourage you to look at it. I'll shoot the link in the chat soon. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the people polled were given 12 issues that they could rank in terms of what were their top issues in this election. And there were only 3 groups that climate change even registered in the top 3. And there was only one group that it was number 1 above everything else, and that was the religiously unaffiliated. And I don't think that's an accident. I think that has a lot to do with the worldview and the priorities of that block of people. And that's kind of been a pattern for a while in terms of climate change being a number 1 issue. So that's I'll come back to that. The second thing was there was centralized leadership was one, and then what was the other one, Jocelyn? Joiners? Not
Yeah,
being
yeah,
joiners,
no,
right.
no centralized leadership or organization. We've had a couple other comments now, though. One person wrote, "It's okay to be religious and political, and the religious community discourages being secular and political." And I would agree with that. And another person wrote, "Fear of being ostracized. For being non-religious, you might be ostracized in the community for running." So those are also
right. Yeah.
potentially.
So I want to address a few of those things. I think that obviously we do have some centralized leadership, but most of that work until this point, and I'm going to share sort of some of my work and some of my client work that folks can join that I think is not very well known, but there's a lot of potential for growth. A lot of the leadership from the national organizations has been C3 work, right? It has to be non-political and non-partisan, with the exception of there's, the Secular Coalition for America has a 501c4 that does lobbying, and C4s can do some amount of political work, which I did at the Secular Coalition, but not to get too in the weeds of sort of tax law and that sort of thing. But C3s cannot endorse candidates or electioneer at all, but they can do some lobbying, but their primary activity has to be charitable, educational, etc. C4s can endorse candidates and can participate in political activities, but that has to be secondary and sort of a minor part. And then, of course, that means that in terms of political activity, there hasn't been a lot of opportunity because, there simply hasn't really been a lot of national organization work that's focused on partisan and political, really electioneering related activity. But now there is, and one that's been around for a while that I know, David Williamson can tell you a lot about as well, because he's now on the board in another capacity, is the Freethought Equality Fund PAC, which is a PAC that endorses openly non-religious candidates for office, and at the federal level, primarily gives them actually some financial support. So one of the things I've done, because they're a client of mine this year, is do 2 fundraisers for a candidate who is openly secular. She's a secular Jew. She would be, if elected to Congress, the first female with a PhD in science to be elected to Congress, and she's challenging a Republican and has a very good chance of winning. I'm mentioning that not to talk about her race or anything, but to mention why that's important, right? So being, if you are a member, which is free, by the way, for the Center for Freethought Equality, you will be informed of candidates who are running as openly non-religious, which means that you have a way to not only connect with those folks, but support them, right? Because as someone mentioned, you can be ostracized for, it's difficult, and I'm sure Jocelyn can speak to this, to run as openly non-religious. We as a community need to make that easier. And one of the things we can do to make it easier is to provide the financial and volunteer support to candidates who are willing to step forward. Because one thing, I know that it can be frustrating to know, and we do know that a lot of non-religious folks actually already serve in office. It's just that they're not coming out and being public about their lack of affiliation with religion. And it's really not enough to expect them to just do it out of political courage and because it's the right thing to do. People have to make pragmatic choices. A lot of times if they think they can do the most good by keeping that quiet, then they will. But things are getting better every single year. That poll about, would you vote an atheist for president is getting a little bit better every year, right? And thanks to the work of the national secular organizations, that stigma is going away a little bit by bit. There's still plenty of work we have to do. But in the meantime, as we continue to destigmatize it, we also need to recognize that politicians, candidates, elected officials, they work in politics, and the currency in politics is people power and money. And that's something that we need to start building and take very seriously. When a candidate or elected official who is willing to be open is running for re-election, where is our community? Are we raising money for them? Are we sending an army of volunteers for them? That's what we need to start building. And so 2 places that there is centralized leadership that can plug you into really bringing your secular identity with you into your politics is the Center for Freethought Equality, which, full disclosure, is a client, and another one of my clients, which is Secular Democrats of America, which I'll talk about in a second. But I do also want to touch on those two other points. One was we're not joiners, right? I really strongly disagree with this notion. I think it's something we've been internalizing for a while because we've been told for so long that we're not joiners. I don't know about you all, but a lot of non-religious people I know join a lot of things. I think what maybe people mean is they don't, sure, of course, they're non-religious. They're not going to a religious institution. That doesn't mean they don't join things. They join lots of things. They join book clubs. They join nonprofit organizations. They join political parties. They join fan club. They join all kinds of things just like everybody else. We're just like everybody else. The problem is that secular people don't tend to bring their secular identity with them into those spaces. And so it's not that you can't find the non-religious, like they're all sitting at home not joining things. It's just that they don't bring their identity with them. That's something that we have to do a lot more work on. And in my experience, when you create the space for people to bring their secular identity with them, they show up. It works. And a lot of times it's kind of like, you have to know to Google something, like you have to kind of know something exists to want to find out more about it. A lot of people still don't realize that there's an organized secular movement that they can join. And so they're not looking for it. I can't tell you how many times I've tabled at an event, or I have just talked to people individually who, when I tell them about the world of organized secularism, they're just like, they light up and they're like, I can't believe I never heard about that. I've had conversations with people who said, if I knew that I could bring my kid to an ethical society or humanistic Jewish congregation, that would have been so much easier for me because I've been trying to navigate how to be a secular parent all this time. And I didn't know there were resources, right? I didn't know that there was a home for me. When I went to the Young Democrats of America convention a few years ago, and I was talking to them about how to message on secular values and express their secularist point of view from the standpoint of talking about freedom and equality and inclusion and knowledge. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, most of the people I talked to said, you know what, I agree with everything you're saying. And I always wanted to sort of express this, but I never had the words. I never had the message. Right? So a lot of this is just creating the space and planting the seed that, yes, you can bring your secular identity with you into the things that you join. So that's sort of my counterpoint on that. We are joiners, but what we're not doing is bringing our secular identity with us. So one thing nobody mentioned was turnout. That is a huge issue that we need to address. It is getting better, and I'm really excited to see the turnout in this election, which I think is going to be particularly high for the non-religious. It's going to be high for a lot of reasons for a lot of people, but I think that given that science is so obviously on the ballot and science is such a top issue for non-religious people, I think we're going to, we'll see how that goes. But this shows up until, I think, 2016, what our turnout is. So you can see that for 4 election cycles, 2008 to 2014, we were at a steady 12%. That's not good. We went up to 15% in 2016. If I remember correctly, I think we went to 17% in 2018, but we're a quarter of the population. And so if we just voted proportionally to our numbers in the electorate, we could deliver millions more votes. A constituency that isn't seen as an opportunity for turnout is not really courted the way that other faith constituencies are. So that's one thing we have to work on. We're getting beat about 2 to 1 at the polls by white evangelicals in terms of turnout. So that's another factor. So this goes back to my point earlier, and these numbers are a few years old. I will admit, I need to update them, but I doubt that this has moved very much. I think maybe support has gone up or down with different groups, but I think the most important thing is the oldest this is possibly is like 2014 or 2016, but I think the orientation is still there, and the big thing is the difference between these two groups, right? So on abortion, whether it should be legal in all or most cases, 74% of the religiously unaffiliated support it, 61% of evangelicals oppose. That's on abortion, like their top issue, and we're more united on that issue on the other side of it than they are. Same thing with same-sex marriage. 85% of the religiously unaffiliated support. I'm sure that number has gone up since this came out. 59% of evangelicals oppose same-sex marriage, right? That's huge, huge difference. Again, think about the agenda of the Christian right. I mean, opposing LGBTQ rights is top on their sort of culture war issues. And yet they're not even as united as you might think, especially compared to the religiously unaffiliated on that issue. And then same thing with this question of whether employers who happen to be religious should be allowed to deny employees insurance that includes birth control. 83% of the religiously unaffiliated saying that that shouldn't be allowed, while 53% of evangelicals saying they should. So again, this really shows that we have very strong shared values. We have a shared perspective on these issues that I think very easily can be communicated as a political agenda. The trick is to start organizing around that agenda, to see each other as part of a voting block and say, hey, you're non-religious, I'm non-religious, or you're religiously unaffiliated, you're, whatever. We agree on all of these issues very, very strongly, and for a reason, because we tend to come to these conclusions from a secular perspective. So here's the breakdown of, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about kind of, the actionable things you can do, especially to that question of like, well, where's the centralized leadership? Like, where can you plug in? I think of how to build political clout in three kind of buckets. One is home district ground game. The other is electoral ground game. And the three is party organizing. So home district ground game is about that all year round, building relationships with your elected officials from Congress down to the very local level, especially right now at the state and local level, around the issues that you care about. And I know a lot of folks at CFFC, you guys are kind of the model for this. So I won't talk a little bit too much about it because, you're already doing it. So, in fact, I know David and Jocelyn have been extremely helpful to me in connecting with lawmakers in Florida that they have, and candidates as well, that they continue to build relationships with. And that's really huge.
I think it's important that you do cover this because this is recorded and a lot of different people will hear it. So
okay, sure, absolutely.
Back, and I wouldn't assume that everybody who's here knows everything that we've been doing. So
okay, that's fair. Thanks for pointing that out. So it's really important, if you're doing action alerts from national organizations, that's great, but that's not what I'm talking about here. That's like the baseline of like contacting your lawmakers when there's a huge issue, like say, opposing Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court. That's great. But when you do an action alert of any kind, what's happening is you're basically submitting something through a web form on a website, right? And again, that is impactful, that matters. I'm not saying that doesn't matter, but that's like very baseline of building a relationship with your lawmaker. What you should be doing year round is when you, and this is also post-COVID times, but I'm sure a lot of them are doing virtual things like this that you can join. So it makes it even easier. Sign up for whether from Congress down to your local city council person to, I would even say your neighborhood advisory. It's called different things at different places, advisory, neighborhood commission, or whatever, right? Those are typically elected positions too. Know who they are and sign up for their newsletter. So because and follow them on social media so that when they have their coffee with constituents or their town hall or whatever, go to some of those events and post-COVID, shake their hand and introduce yourself, right? And then, same thing for these virtual events, get a sense of what's going on. And especially, post-COVID, a lot of times they have a staff member with them as well at some of these events. So you want to build an actual relationship with your lawmaker and their staff and have somebody's card, right? Because you want to move from sending web form emails to having an actual exchange with a person who represents their office. And so, for example, let's say you are concerned about, and I'm sure this is an issue in Florida, what's going on with school curriculum in your community and science being taught as science in your public schools. Well, who represents you on the school board? Right? When is their next meeting? How can you voice your opinion and maybe bring some other folks in your community with you to go to that meeting and express yourself? One thing that I found really frustrating as I've made these kinds of presentations is that I find in red states, a lot of people tell me, well, the person that represents me is never going to agree with me, so there's no point in contacting them. And then I go to blue areas and they say, oh, well, my representative kind of agrees with everything I say anyway, so there's no reason to contact them. You see the problem there? You know, we have to, in the case of red area, you still need to make your voice heard. You know, you can't make it so easy, you know, to have our rights and our Constitution trampled on without a fight. And also remember that you can soften a lawmaker's position. And, you know, Jocelyn was saying earlier how just by running, she is making the incumbent do some work that they haven't done for 8 years, right? That's important. So it's always important to make your voice heard. You're not going to be a constituency with clout ever if you're not a visible constituency in the first place. And if you're in an area where your rep agrees with you, great, they're an ally, but how can you cultivate them to make them a champion of secularism? There's always something more that our allies can be doing to advance constitutional secularism and the rights of non-religious folks and science-based policy. So home district ground game, I mean, especially, you know, pre-COVID with in-person meetings, I mean, all of these lawmakers for the most part have an office that you can go to and schedule a meeting. So few people do this that the ones that do just have an outsized voice. They are disproportionately represented because, again, so few people tend to do this. This is something that the Christian right has done for decades. They have people that are meeting with and building relationships with lawmakers, especially at the state and local level, year round. This is not something you just do when there's a big issue coming up. This is something you really need to be doing year round. And the great thing is, it's not lobbying because you have a right as a constituent who, by the way, pays your lawmakers' salaries through your taxes. You have a right to have a relationship with them and be heard on the issues. And especially when you get to the state and local level, I mean, depending on the state, Florida, this probably isn't the case because it's fairly large. Some states, they don't even have staff. They can't afford staff. So when you schedule a meeting, you're not scheduling a meeting with staff, you're scheduling a meeting with the actual lawmaker. And by the way, if you do get a meeting with staff, don't be afraid that, oh, well, they're not taking me seriously because I'm not meeting with the head honcho. The staff are the ones who actually do most of the work. Those are the ones that have, you know, make recommendations to their boss. They're the gatekeepers. You really want to build a good relationship with staff. And just one more word on this before I move on to electoral ground game. One of the most important things about building these relationships, it's not just for the sake of knowing them and glad handing, right? It's because you want to establish yourself as a subject matter expert, right? As the go-to person that if that lawmaker or their staff ever has a religious freedom or science-based policy related issue come up, they're going to think, oh, I know so-and-so who's been to our office has made clear that they're happy to be a resource on that issue. I'm going to call them. And I'll give you just a brief story of how impactful this can be. I was lobbying the DC Council on the DC Death with Dignity Act. If you're not familiar, death with dignity laws make it legal for someone who has a diagnosis of 6 months or less to live from a terminal illness to end their life, to request a prescription to medication that they can take. It's their choice to end their life if and when they choose to have some autonomy at the end of their life when they're facing great suffering. Oregon has been the pioneering state, and I don't remember how many states we're at right now. It's something like 5 or 6 states have legalized it, and DC also did as well. But while we were still in the process of lobbying for its passage, I met with a council member's office who had literally been lied to by an opposition group to the bill. And I can tell you that bill was only like 3 or 4 pages long, if that, maybe 6. I don't remember. It was a very short bill to read, but clearly the council member and their staff hadn't read it, right? And this is one of the things you'll learn as you get involved in this kind of advocacy is that they have so many things they have to make decisions about. And they, especially again, at the state and local level, their resources may be really, really strained. And so, you know, nobody is an expert on everything, right? Maybe the lawmaker has a few issues they're expert in and the staff have a few issues they're expert in, but generally they have to go really, really wide and aren't able to go very deep. And so that's why outside organizations that are trusted and that's where you build that trust, have a lot of influence. Because again, if you are the go-to source on an issue, you want them to call you when that stuff comes up. So in this meeting, they told me, yeah, we have a concern that someone with diabetes could qualify for this bill. That was a total lie. And I pointed it out for them. I said, actually, the bill's language is very clear that you can only be someone with a terminal diagnosis, 6 months or less to live. And you actually have to be confirmed by 2 separate doctors that can confirm that that diagnosis is correct. No one with diabetes or anything other than that specific scenario would qualify for this, right? So they were lied to. And it was easy to lie to them because they hadn't read the bill and maybe they weren't going to read the bill, right? So I did 2 things in that meeting. One, I corrected the lie and gave them the correct information, but I did another important thing, which is to make clear that I was a trusted source on this issue, and whoever lied to them is not. I'll bet you they're probably not going to take anything that group has to say very seriously again after I just exposed to them that they were lied to, in the name of furthering whatever that group's agenda was, right? So that's part of building a trusted source. Now imagine if there had been nobody on the other side correcting that, right? And so that's a huge part of what you do when you build these relationships is you educate lawmakers and you establish yourself and your local secular community as a subject matter expert go-to, right? So that's one thing that we really need to do a lot more of is building those relationships year round, not just when something is on fire, right? Because especially if you're in an area where you can make some progress, right? Let's convert our allies into champions. So electoral ground game. This is getting involved in elections, right? So obviously there's nonpartisan ways to do that, and that's important too. And this is where if we bring our secular identity with us when we do voter registration, that shows the political operatives, right, who are involved in elections. We want them to see that humanists and atheists, secularists show up and help register people to vote, because that's a huge piece of currency in this sphere, right? Is like who can turn out the vote. So we want to be able to turn out our own numbers, but we also want to show that we have the ground game to actually get out the vote in general, which obviously in particular helps, I would say Democrats, but both sides, obviously, all sides are concerned with getting the vote out. And then engaging with candidates. You can actually have a candidate forum as if you're part of a 501c3 organization. You just have to do it in a very specific way. But you also, as an individual with a group of like-minded people, can engage with candidates. Offer to do a fundraiser, like host a fundraiser in your home. It doesn't have to be the kind of thing where it's like, you're raising $1 million, especially if it's a state and local level. Part of it is just, not only are you raising money for the candidate, but you're giving them an opportunity to meet with community leaders that and meet with voters. Obviously, this is, again, like a post-COVID thing, but you can also do this virtually, right? And that's what I did this year with the candidate that I mentioned. Bring them into contact with people in the secular community who wanted to support her and did support her. And that does a service, obviously, not just for the candidate, but for our community, because we want the secular community to be just like a de facto constituency group that campaigns put on their list of outreach, right? Because they do that with faith constituencies. We know that they do, but are we on the radar? Well, one of the things we can't just wait for them to come to us and sit here and complain that we're not, part of the campaign schedule, right? We need to get on their schedule by demonstrating that, you get something out of including the secular community. We will do fundraisers. We will get out the vote. We can put you in touch with community leaders who maybe have connections that are of interest to you, right? But what we get in return is not only being on the radar, but also expressing our issues. If you're elected, what will you do on XYZ issue that our community cares about? And then if you get them on the record on an issue and then they get elected, you get to come back and say, it was great to support you. I'd love to work with you now that you're elected on this issue that you said you would work on as a candidate, right? So that's how electoral ground game translates into home district ground game as well, right? We want to have this cycle of being involved in the elections and then working with our allies and champions who are elected to get our priorities advanced. And then party organizing. So party organizing is a great example of that, what I was talking about earlier, the issue of we're joiners, but we're not bringing the secular identity in with us. I think something like about a third of the Democratic Party, like members of the Democratic Party or at least registered Democrats, are non-religious, right? We're a huge, huge chunk of the Democratic Party. That's just how it is. So obviously, you know, non-religious folks are joining the Democratic Party. It's not like we're not joining. But again, it's about, are we joining and making our secular identity known in that capacity? And that is something that I've been working a lot on since 2016. So I know some of you have probably heard this story, but for those who haven't, in 2016, I went to the Texas Democratic Party convention. And the reason I did is because there were two volunteers I was working with who, in addition to their sort of nonpartisan volunteering that they were doing, they also happened to be really active Democrats in the Texas Democratic Party, and the state convention was coming up and they wanted to make an impact. So we did a few things. We had an event at the convention, a secular caucus, and we drafted what are called planks or resolutions, basically proposals for the party to consider adding to their platform. And all of those had to do with church-state separation. One of them called for removing the religious test for office that is still part of the Texas state constitution. It's not enforceable constitutionally, but it's still on the books, right? So it was a one-page thing, bringing that to light and calling for its removal. So 3 of those planks made it into the Texas Democratic Party platform that year, including that one calling for the removal for the religious test. Excuse me. And the secular caucus event, which, by the way, we did not have a lot of time to market. And I bring that up because the turnout was incredible. I mean, it was 300 plus people, standing room only. And I guarantee you that most of the people who showed up got their program when they walked into the convention, saw secular caucus, and they made a beeline for it. Why? Because if you are a Democrat in Texas, you have a real sense of urgency around church-state separation. Whether you're religious or you're not, you understand that Texas has a problem with separation of church and state that needs to be addressed. And sure enough, when we went back 2 years later in 2018 and had an event that was just as successful, I wish I'd done this in 2016, but in 2018, I asked the crowd, I said, raise your hand if you're a person of faith. And half the room raised their hand. And I really want to highlight that, because that means half of the room are people of faith who went intentionally to a secular caucus, were clapping alongside everybody else, and had no problem with the fact that a bunch of candidates had just spoken to them about how they're openly non-religious, and obviously also about church-state separation, right? And they were all for it. They were all in, which just goes to show that, again, we can mobilize that full block of religiously unaffiliated, including the ones who are believers, because, you know, there is a way to bridge that divide. We don't have to give up the fact that we need to stand up for non-religious people and our rights and increase our representation. You know, there's a difference. We don't believe in a religious test for office, but representation does matter. And it's perfectly fine for us to say we should have more elected officials who are openly non-religious, because a quarter of the population is non-religious or at least unaffiliated. And we have people of faith who will stand by us with that. And that's really important, especially when you think about messaging, that we're not talking about spreading atheism or we're talking about spreading secularism, advancing secularism, and secularism benefits people of all faiths and none. So it's not like you have to sacrifice the two. I think sometimes there's a false choice presented to people that we either have to, talk about the rights of atheists or, something else. But I think we can be very inclusive of people of faith, but also establish a space where it is clear that that space is a place for non-religious people to be their whole authentic selves as non-religious people. And we can work on that common ground. So I bring Texas up. Texas, that was 2016. There is now secular Democrats of Texas, secular Democrats of Nebraska are both recognized caucuses within their state party. And that resolution that Jocelyn mentioned earlier is a really good example of the impact of this kind of work, because that resolution was sponsored by a DNC member from Nebraska. Why Nebraska? Because we had secular Democrats in Nebraska who had already gone through an educational process with their party leadership about why a secular caucus should exist in the party. And so that back and forth, and there was a back and forth. I mean, I watched the proceedings, which were online, when the party voted on whether they would accept secular Democrats of Nebraska as a caucus. And There were some people who were against it, and there were some people, including people of faith in the party, who stood up for it, right? So that exchange of ideas, that whole conversation had already happened. And so we were able to get support on a resolution like that. And that's the value of having an internal structure within these parties. And obviously not everyone here is necessarily a Democrat. You can do this whether you're Republican, Libertarian, Green. If you're not if you're anti-party, I don't know what to tell you. You can get involved in the home district and the other stuff that I was talking about. But these are structures where our folks are already involved. But we need to start building spaces where we can organize around secularism and the rights of non-theists and our agenda. And this is something that other groups also do. I mean, it's probably difficult to find a state Democratic Party that doesn't have a women's caucus or an LGBTQ caucus. What do those caucuses do? Well, there are affiliate groups within the party that get women or LGBTQ folks elected to office. They pull the resources to help them out. They advocate within the party to make their issues a priority or to make them a part of the platform. That's what our caucuses are doing. And they're also doing some great advocacy work. So Secular Democrats of Texas, for example, has gotten resolutions passed in 2 counties, Austin and Travis County, that basically ban conversion therapy and say that the local city council will not do business with entities that support conversion therapy. They are now raising money for themselves so that they can now give money to the candidates who are openly non-religious and supportive of secularism that they are endorsing, right? So you can see how this all comes together. If we are bringing our secular identity into a political space, let's just say a Democratic Party, but it could be any party, we now have a place where all the joiners, right, of the party have a place to organize around these shared values and pool the resources that we need and lead in the state. This is what's really beautiful about Secular Democrats of America, which is the national organization. Basically, Secular Democrats of America is a PAC that helps seed these new caucuses. And the latest one, by the way, is in Florida. So Secular Democrats of Florida just started. They have a chair, a vice chair, a secretary, a treasurer. You can become a member. And they literally just got stood up in the last month, right? So that's a direct, if you're a Floridian and you happen to be a Democrat, that's something you can plug into now, right? So they're going to be following in the footsteps of Texas and Nebraska, endorsing candidates, supporting those candidates with financial and volunteer support, and advocating within the Florida Democratic Party to make sure secularism is a top agenda item. And the other thing that I think that I've been working on and that I think is important that secular Democrats are uniquely qualified to do is to just educate. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, for example, and again, I'm not trying to be partisan. This is just where the space that I work. With the Democratic Party, there's a lot of overlap around these issues. Like obviously climate change, for example, is a top issue, but secularists come to the conclusions that we come to from a different perspective, right? So we have a really unique way of thinking about these issues. And we also think and talk about religious freedom a lot and what it actually means, because our community is particularly concerned with separation of church and state and how it's being undermined. And one thing that I know a lot of people in the Democratic Party agree with, but are sort of not well prepared to do, is to talk about those issues, right? What I think is happening a lot is Democrats get trapped in framing around religious freedom that is just not, that in my view is Republican framing, right? That is undermining our ability to actually counter program these ideas about our founding, for example, that we're a Christian nation. And for example, I won't mention the candidate. There was a candidate in the primary that was asked about whether houses of worship that won't marry same-sex couples should have their tax status revoked. And they answered that question really, really poorly because they didn't realize they had just walked into a trap. There's no organization, LGBT, atheist, or otherwise, who has ever advocated that houses of worship should be forced to marry same-sex couples. It's always been about what's happening in the courts, right? Like the government recognizing that marriage, not what churches or synagogues or mosques want to do. But that's the framing of the issue. And so that's exactly the kind of thing that I think causes a lot of candidates to stay away from our issues because they're not well versed in them and they're afraid to kind of step in it. But there's obviously a really good way to message on these issues if candidates are just really well-versed and understand the importance of talking about church-state separation and talking about religious freedom, and also talking about their faith or lack thereof in an authentic way that's not pandering. So who's going to have those conversations? Who's going to have that as a top priority to talk about with candidates and party leadership and all the folks who are involved in elections and candidates and all of that? It's our community. I think our community is uniquely positioned to be initiating those conversations. And so that's one of the many reasons that it's great to bring your secular identity into the political sphere, because you can initiate those conversations, educate folks who actually do agree with us, but maybe they just haven't thought about these issues, or, you know, they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because it seems kind of like a, you know, a landmine. But we need to make it easier to have those conversations, because the other side certainly is, right? And they have messaging, they have, they're very disciplined, but the folks who really support secularism, like secularism needs an advocate, and that can be our community, whether it's talking to your elected officials, talking to candidates, or talking to party leadership. I'm gonna try to wrap up in a few minutes so we have time for Q&A. I just wanna give a shout out to Secular America Votes. This was covered, this is actually Secular Student Alliance this year is running Secular America Votes, so I would check that out, secularamerica.votes.org. But I just wanna show you this because this was pretty cool. I mean, the Wall Street Journal covered this. And I think, again, just by doing this work, people really do come out of the woodwork, in my experience, if you just create the space. There's a lot of excitement around the idea. You know, people are starting to notice the numbers because we are growing so rapidly. And so we just need to kind of meet the moment. This is the 2018 Texas Democratic Party Convention Secular Caucus. You can see that there are people lined up with their backs against the wall all along the sides, and you can't see this, but people were literally sitting on the floor in the front. Like, this is how much demand there was to attend a secular caucus. And the other neat thing was we had a panel of like 4 or 5 candidates that had already pre-prepared to speak at this thing. But what happens in these conventions is, you know, people are free flowing, going between different events, and candidates would walk by and be like, wow, this is a really full room. What is this? And we'd say it's a secular caucus, and explain what that was. And they'd say, oh, great. Can I come pitch my campaign? I'm supportive of this. And then they would come in and they would make their pitch and talk about how much they support separation of church and state, just on the fly, right? Because think about that interaction. It's like, oh, clearly the secular folks are really well organized because they've got a really full room here. How can I pander basically to this group of people? That's what we want. We want them to see that if they reach out to our community and speak to the issues that we care about, that they can actually get attention. So that was a really great moment of showing it what it means to kind of show up in force and what we can get in exchange in terms of what we want to see. So to wrap up, we need to start raising money. We need to work on our turnout. We need to have more people power, both in terms of our home districts at all levels of government, as well as when it's election time. And we need to start talking about what our shared values and shared issues are. The data is there. We know that we agree on these issues. I think we need to shift a little bit away from focusing so much on shared identity and focus more on shared values and a shared agenda about what we'd like, how we'd like to be governed. The last thing I'll say as an example, very recently, is to give you kind of a sense of, in addition to Secular Democrats of Florida, which just got started, there is a group of local secular leaders in Southern California who just organized a Humanists Flip the Senate event, where I think they raised at the event something like over $6,000 for a number of Senate events, which, listen, when we can't compare ourselves to organizations that have been organizing for decades, that, have a huge donor network, right? This is very new for the secular community to be doing political fundraising. But I thought that was a major success. And the thing that I loved about it is it was totally initiated by local secular community leaders who said, you know what? We already work with each other in another capacity, but I know you're a Democrat and I'm a Democrat and you're a Democrat. And we think that the Senate races are really important to furthering secularism because of what's going on with the courts and all these other issues. And so let's do a fundraiser together and get other secular Democrats to join us and raise money for these Senate races. That's huge. And that's something we need to see more of. And so one thing I would ask you is, remember, this is a big election, but there's going to be more elections, and there's going to be a lot less attention to the off year. And that's where you can make an outsized amount of difference. When no one's paying attention and it's a state or local race, that's where you can make a ton of a difference. And you don't have to be really, really wealthy to do this stuff, right? Like host fundraisers at your home when you can, or virtually. Start identifying folks that you work with in a sort of nonpartisan secular sphere. And if you know that they wear a hat that is similar to yours, if they are a secular Democrat like you, or a secular libertarian, or even a secular Republican, start networking with each other and work in the political sphere together on that. Start fundraising as that identity. Start mobilizing volunteers for candidates in that capacity, because then our community, which our joiners, are actually going to be recognized as the constituency and potential voting bloc that we are. So I'm going to stop there. I think I covered most of this, but these are some other suggestions for folks. And I will close there and answer any questions you folks may have.
Thank you so much. That's a lot of information. I really appreciate your time. I would like to say that we do know that there are other party members besides Democrats who participate in our activities, and Sarah is bringing her experience and her knowledge about where secularism rests on the spectrum, and it usually lands on the left side of center when it comes to partisan politics. And she is a guest here today, and she's not here to promote a candidate or party, and her party does not necessarily, her talk is not representing an official statement or opinion of the CFFC. As a rule, as an organization, we do not engage in partisan politics. I just wanted to throw that out there so that there's no confusion. Absolutely. I do have some questions.
I'm not speaking for the party either.
Well, we're going to get to that question. So I'm going to start with one from the beginning, which is, you were talking about the religiously unaffiliated. And one of the questions was, how are secular Jews counted?
That's a really good question. I think you have to look at the methodology of the poll. I mean, I'm a secular Jew, and depending on the way the question is asked, I might be counted along with Jews instead of the unaffiliated, right? Because I'm a cultural Jew, and unfortunately, polling can sort of be limited. And so it's a question of, well, are they distinguishing between cultural Jews and religious Jews? It depends on the poll. But what I can say is, we know that I think about half, if not a little more than half, of Jews in the United States do not believe in God. So a huge amount of them are part of the community.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I have a question here. What about the Republican Party? Most of the references today have been towards the Democratic Party. Can you speak to the Republican Party perhaps a little more succinctly? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think all the things that secular Democrats are doing are things that you can do in your Republican Party. In fact, I went out of my way to try to identify secular Republicans, and there's really not many out there, unfortunately, right now, because I think, the reality, and this is just an objective observation, white evangelicals and the Christian right have so much influence on the Republican Party at this point, that I think it's definitely an even more uphill climb, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be working on that, right? And it depending on your state. I think there's certain states that are probably a lot more amenable to secular organizing within the Republican Party than others. I'm thinking about like very purple states, or states like Maine or New Hampshire or Alaska, like that have like that independent streak, and you see that in kind of their senators, right? You're thinking like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. New Hampshire has a way above average level of disaffiliation with religion. And compared to the national average. And I do know that I had been working with some folks who are Republican secularists in Michigan. And I do know a gentleman in Texas, actually, as well. So, all the things I said you can do in the Republican Party, like the first step is identify other secularist Republicans. And the trick is, they can't just be non-religious. They have to actually prioritize this issue. Is it a top issue for them to bring secularism back to the party? And if that's the case, then identify other secular Republicans who prioritize that issue, and start forming a caucus, right? And it depends, and it doesn't have to be a caucus. There's a lot of different ways you can organize. You could just have secular Republicans for enter candidate, right? Like host a fundraiser for a candidate who shares that value with you, or who maybe is religious, but is a Republican who supports separation of church and state. Volunteer for those kinds of campaigns. And start having conversations with your leadership about this. Caucuses, again, it depends on the state, but in general, go to your leadership and find out what are the rules to start a caucus in your party, right? In some states, it's really, really easy and informal. In some states, there's a bunch of different rules. But at the end of the day, if you just start identifying each other and create a space for secular Republicans in your area or beyond to talk to each other and start organizing, that is it's the same thing that secular Democrats are doing. I wouldn't tell you to do anything differently. It's just that, I think the hill that you have to climb is a lot steeper, and you would have to probably adjust your messaging a little bit to really speak to some of the conservatives who might be a little bit wary. But I think you absolutely can find common ground. And one of the things you can do is really go back in history and talk about how religious groups that were once Catholics, for example, were discriminated against on the basis of religion by Protestants, right? Mormons are a great constituency to work with, actually, because it's very recent in their history. They remember being persecuted for being a religious minority. And so I do think there's conversations to be had. You just have to create the space to network secular Republicans together and to start having that conversation with leadership.
Okay. Wow. That was a very thorough response. So you referred to the non-religious, the secularists and atheists as all having unique identities. What is the intersection that you're seeing there? And is there a better singular identity?
The intersection is our views on issues and our values, right? So if you look, all of whether if you're non-religious, you're unaffiliated with a religion, you're going to be part of that 1 in 5 Americans, right? Whether you identify as atheist or whatever label you use. If you're unaffiliated with a religious affiliation, that's where you're falling. And what we know about that block of people is that we agree in very large numbers on a lot of issues. So that's the intersection, is where we end up. Our conclusions about issues like death with dignity, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, climate change, and even issues outside of the traditional church-state separation issues like immigration and racism. Look at the numbers. We're very united on those issues for the most part. Not the full 100%. I mean, no constituency is a monolith, right? But the numbers are pretty impressive. So that's the intersection, is where we stand on issues. And I think where we stand on separation of church and state, and the fact that policy should be based on science. And, with one of the top issues for the unaffiliated being climate change, I think that the perspective, whether you're an atheist or sort of an unattached believer or whatever, I think most people have the sense that, if you don't believe in a literal afterlife and you believe that there's only one life and one planet, then the sense of urgency is even greater for someone like that, I think, than perhaps people who care very much about the planet, but also have, a thought about, a very literal idea of kind of what's going to happen after. I think understanding that this is a human-driven problem and that only human beings can save it, and there's not going to be any sort of higher power to intervene, I think is my personal, take of like why I think so many non-religious people support that issue. The question about one singular identity, like I said before, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think there is no perfect word to describe this group of people, because it encompasses so many different shades of lack of affiliation and like sort of believing but not believing, and then being an atheist. There's no one word that's going to encapsulate everybody. The best that I think we have, and it's imperfect, is non-religious or religiously unaffiliated or secular. And even secular is kind of problematic, right? Because it's like, well, are you describing the person or are you describing the institution, right? Like a secular institution is just right.
But if we're having this strong issue support, then is there any point in us organizing based on being religiously unaffiliated? I mean, if the environment is my thing, let's just say I'm all about the environment, why don't I just go volunteer and get involved with environmental stuff and in candidates that reflect that, and I could just ignore the whole religion question?
Right, that's a good question. Well, I would say, first of all, you can do that, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I do think that when you do get involved in environmental work, you should bring your secular identity with you and make clear that the reason that you're motivated to be there, and just in addition to just being pro-environment, that you also happen to be a secularist, and you're concerned about how religious, the idea of Christian dominionism, is impacting policy toward the environment. I think, we get in this place where we think that a lot of people think that the Christian right is only concerned with culture war issues, but that's not actually true. The leadership of the Christian right has a biblical explanation for their views on tax policy and the environment and climate. I mean, there is an alliance between corporate interests and the Christian right that has to be recognized, right? And they have clergy and faith leadership who are writing interpretations of the Bible to justify those conservative policies. Now, there might be folks here who agree with those conservative policies for other reasons, but just understand that, again, we have a unique perspective on these issues that we can bring, because you're not really going to hear environmental groups talk about Christian dominionism, right? But it's worth talking about, because the advisors to the president of the United States are giving him and his cabinet members sermons and Bible verses that they use to justify the kinds of policies that the administration is putting forth. And it's not limited to just reproductive rights and LGBT issues. It's way beyond the culture issues. And so, one, I would say, I'm not saying you should only do environmental work in a secular space. If there's well-established organizations you can join, do that, but bring your secular identity with you and bring that perspective with you. And I also think that, if we care about our community, the non-religious, being recognized as a constituency, this is just what we have to do. If you don't think that it's, if it's just not an important factor to you, to the fact that you're unaffiliated, then, just be what you want to be. I'm not going to tell people that they have to affiliate with the unaffiliated as a block, but I do think that we share values, and we do have a compelling reason to be recognizing each other as part of a block, because I think we do have a unique perspective on the world, and there is still stigma on being non-religious, and there are certain issues that are just not going to be discussed at all, or discussed from our perspective, if we're not voicing ourselves as an unaffiliated, religiously unaffiliated voice.
That's very true. I actually have a couple questions, but because of time, I'm going to take one, because I think this is going to be a bit of a longer answer, perhaps. How do you explain the apparent distance in opinion between the large Christian advocacy organization leadership and the followers on issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, and the Johnson Amendment? It seems like the organizations are far more dogmatic than the followers.
Institutions meaning like the Catholic Church and that sort of thing, or just.
Yes. Yeah. Institutions that are out there saying, they're only pro-life, nothing else can happen. The Liberty Council, things like that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember just how huge these faith traditions are. I mean, think about the amount of people in the world that identify as Catholic, right? So I just don't think it's even realistic to think that at this point, with the amount of just use Catholics as an example, with the amount of Catholics in the world, I don't think that it's possible for the institution to actually be representative of all the Catholics in the world and how they actually live their lives. But because for a lot of people, their religious tradition kind of melds into sort of their culture, and think about all the Christians who still identify as Christian and maybe still believe, but they're really only going to church during Christmas and Easter, right? Why do they do that? Well, because it's cultural at that point. It's tradition. It means a lot more than just the theology. For a lot of people, it's community. This is one of the things that I think the secular community has been grappling with, is that a lot of people. Some people, they leave their faith and they don't want anything that looks or feels like church, but a lot of people do. If they leave their faith, they miss the music, they miss the community, right? Like there's things that people affiliate with religion for that actually have nothing to do with the theology. And I don't think the keepers of the theology, of course, are going to be the most fundamentalist, or the closest to, they're going to be the last to evolve, right? So, I think about the Jewish tradition also, right? Like you have a huge amount of Israeli society, for example, being very, very secular, but the keepers of the tradition, right? The keepers of the religion that kind of gives the country its like Jewish religious identity, they're going to be the most conservative, right? The ones that are studying the Torah all day. And of course, there's always degrees, but I feel like whoever sort of is the sort of keeper of the tradition tends to be the most conservative, right? Like last to evolve. And then there's just like a natural evolution of, it's just kind of, I can't see how it would be any other way that there wouldn't eventually you wouldn't eventually, especially when they're this large, for the institution to be out of step with everyday folks. And anecdotally, I've talked about this with individuals before, and I get the sense that people kind of disassociate they don't associate themselves and their tradition with the institution, right? Especially, part of it is because they're so large, they have that luxury. Like I remember talking to a friend who's Catholic who went to this clearly very progressive Catholic school where they were not against birth control and they were not against abortion. And it was in New York City, right? But, who's to say, there's still all the people there and the leadership there were Catholic, right? People can get to kind of claim whatever identity they want to. And if they, believe in, we know, right, as non-religious people, that you can kind of just take scripture and make what you want of it, right? And what I got from that conversation is that, she associated with her church, right, and how she grew up, and didn't feel like whatever the Vatican was doing spoke for her. I think there can be a debate about whether or not that's kind of a privilege you should wield, right? Like, shouldn't you maybe you should take responsibility for the institution that you're, essentially affiliating with. But I do think that for a lot of religious folks, they don't really take their cues from the institution, and their affiliation with it is a lot more complex. Like they don't see themselves as sort of direct subordinates.
Yeah, that makes sense. I personally think that we've seen a change now in the Catholic Church with the recent announcement from the Pope about LGBTQ marriage. I suspect that's that's obviously a debate going on for them in their circles. So there's clearly a change that can happen probably from the people. So this is an example of where the ground up is changing, I guess you'd say, the head of the organization.
Right.
This has been awesome. I am going to stop here and say it's so wonderful to have you here. If you have any final, you want to talk about something, like go to this website or go somewhere or do something, now's the time to share that with everyone. And then I will have some words to close out.
Sure. Well, I will say, I'll just, show these slides again. I don't think I showed this one of how to get involved as an individual. So I would say, reach out to local chapter of your political party, attend the next meeting. And, again, just because the election is over soon, that doesn't mean there's not going to be more elections, right? And we can have an outsized impact in state and local races, especially in the off year. So please, don't let this election be the end of your activism. You can, and this is for the party organizing, check your statewide party website for opportunities. Vote, obviously, if you haven't voted yet. I assume most of you in Florida, so make a plan to vote. I'll let Jocelyn David give any more information that's more, I don't know what the deadlines and such are in the situation in Florida. And again, volunteer with organizations that represent your values, volunteer for a candidate who inspires you and speaks to your values. There are some great candidates running in Florida, and I'm hoping that'll continue. Know what's on your ballot. I'm sure that this, folks on this call are probably very engaged, but just be really aware of not just what's going on at the presidential level, but the state and local level, and understanding your ballot measures. And just, if you have any questions or want to get involved, contact me. I really encourage you, if you want to get involved in the political sphere, to join Secular Democrats of America at seculardems.org if you happen to identify as a secular Democrat. If you don't, I encourage you to do all the things we talked about for your political party. Secular values and separation of church and state should be a nonpartisan issue. And so if you are a Republican or a Libertarian, I would really encourage you to bring those values to your party. and become a member of the Center for Freethought Equality. It's free. Just go to the website, and I'll drop those in the chat in a second while you close out, Jocelyn. That's a great way to get involved. And oh, I wasn't even sharing the slides, was I? During that whole time?
You were before, but you were not now.
Sorry. Okay, I'll show those in a sec. I'll share again, and I'll drop them in the chat. But there is a way to get involved in the political sphere. Please do so, and reach out to me if you have any other questions about getting involved.
Thank you so much. You're really awesome. I can say without a doubt, you are so enthusiastic and so engaged and so knowledgeable that it is simply a joy to listen to you share these things with us. It's not often we find someone who knows something about all of this, and I really enjoy it. So thank you. So before we go, a quick reminder, we are continuing our meetup events, including Freethought cafes and secular women events as Zoom meetings. All of these events are online, so you can join us from anywhere if you have an internet connection or mobile data. If you want to find out how to join us, you need to go to Meetup and sign up at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. We'll put this and the other links in the chat so you can find them there. Again, if you want to, the emails that we send out, sign up at tinyurl/CFFC newsletter. It's once a month when it gets out. We've had a little bit of trouble lately, and I apologize for that. Before we go, I want to remind you that early voting is open around the country, but it is open here in Florida. You can go to a number of places for more information, but you can find out more on our website at cflfreethought.org/voting. So get out and do your part. We don't want to be part of that 15%. We want to raise the number higher than the number that Sarah was sharing with us. So thanks for joining us, everyone. Go vote. If you've already voted, get your friends and family members to vote, your neighbors, drag them, offer to pay for their transportation. You want to get them there. So bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.